Hello, friends. This is Joshua Coleman, and I'm going to present the argument from consciousness, go a little bit more in depth into the argument over the PowerPoint that I created a few weeks ago. We all know we have a conscious experience. We associate that with mental processes in our brain. Now, if atheism is true, then all there is just space, time, matter, and all the laws that govern the universe. So, if all there is space, time, and matter, can this produce a non-material consciousness? That's what the question is. We can produce a material brain in a material universe, but is it the same thing as a conscious mind? And that's what the question is. This is what naturalist philosophers call the problem of mind. This is actually a problem, so many atheists will actually reject consciousness, such as Dr. Rosenberg, who Dr. Craig, we watched their debate earlier in the class. The reason they reject consciousness is because intentionality in consciousness gives a strong case for God, as we're going to see in this argument. Intentionality is the property of being of something or about something. For example, I can think about my homework or my wife, but a lump of matter like a table or hammer cannot be about anything, only mental states. If you remember Dr. Rosenberg, he was forced to conclude that there really aren't any intentional states. And Dr. Craig brought this up as kind of humorous because he said, it's pretty obvious we have conscious states. I'm actually thinking about the argument right now. And Dr. Rosenberg was forced to kind of just scratch his head and really not be able to give any adequate answer. And as we'll see, that any physicalist, or especially strong physicalist, really doesn't have a good answer for this. And there's no different back about 50 years ago with Leibniz. He back in his day, he was facing a very strong mechanicalistic scientism back in his day, but his viewpoint was that consciousness or perception can't possibly be explained by physical processes. Now, this quote is taken straight from our book, The Blackwell's Companion. This is J.P. Moreland. He stressed very much that we understand the naturalist grand story, and there's not much to it. That really, just all reality is just space, time, and matter. We all know the story. Nothing exploded one day, and here we all are. But how does material physical objects give rise to inanimate objects such as the mind, or ideas, or intentionality, or perception? Richard Dawkins said, just because science so far has failed to explain something such as consciousness, to say it follows that the facile, pathetic explanations which religion has produced somehow by default must win the argument is really quite ridiculous. But really, is saying we don't have an answer really an answer? Now, a lot of times atheists will argue this is just God of the gaps. But logically, God is the conclusion to, as we'll see, to the argument from consciousness. This is a perfect segue into the argument itself. Dr. Craig, in his debate with Dr. Rosenberg, he calls him out on this logical fallacy that is reductio ad absurdum, to suggest that conscious events actually do not exist, because obviously we're both thinking about the arguments right now. We're all having conscious events going on right now. It's very obvious. That's why the first two premises in this argument you won't have to spend a lot of time with, especially in the book. J.P. Moreland, he didn't. All the naturalists that he used as examples, they all agree with 1 and 2, and most naturalists you find are going to agree that mental events are genuine, non-physical mental entities that exist. They do in fact exist. No, there's a lot of hard physicalists and a lot of fringe naturalists that will like Rosenberg who will reject consciousness, that it even exists. So premise 1, mental events are genuine non-physical mental entities that exist. Premise 2, specific mental and physical event types are regularly correlated. Probably one of the most important is premise 3, there is an explanation for these correlations. Premise 4, personal explanation is different than natural scientific explanation. Premise 5, the explanation for these correlations is either a personal or natural scientific explanation. Another important premise is 6, the explanation is not a natural scientific one. 7, from 6 we conclude, therefore, the explanation is a personal one. Premise 8, if the explanation is personal, then it is theistic. And we'll talk about that big jump right there. And conclusion number 9, therefore, the explanation is theistic. So again, the premises 1 and 2 are we're not going to spend much time on because the majority of naturalists and theists alike agree that mental events do in fact exist, and that specific mental and physical event types are regularly correlated, that the brain and the mind, there is a correlation between the two. One affects the other or vice versa. When we look at premise 3, which is probably one of the most important ones, there's good reason to think that there is correlation. There's obviously correlations between mental states in the brain. The mind is actively able to change the chemical makeup of the brain. Wilder Penfield, he was a researcher. He could raise arms involuntarily, vocalize patients involuntarily, as well as recall memories to patients just by stimulating different parts of the brain. In studies, however, he could not involuntarily force patients to act. He could not stimulate the will, and there was a difference, even though there was a correlation. Wilder Penfield, in his book The Mystery of the Mind, said there is no place in the cerebral cortex where an electrical stimulation will cause a patient to decide. He concluded there was a causal force missing which could not be explained from brain chemistry alone. He argued the mind was not in the brain chemistry and could not be explained by it. Another problem that naturalists face, and that does show that there is a correlation between, that there is a good explanation for these correlations, is different parts of the brain stored different pieces of information about perception, such as the color of an object and the shape of that same object. They're stored in different areas of the brain, totally opposite ends of the brain, in fact. There's no place where the brain combines this information into a unified perception. That perception and the shape and the color of the object are correlated, so there has to be an explanation. This is known as the visual binding problem. Where do brains combine information to form one unified perception, like what we subjectively experience in reality? The visual systems of the brain have been completely mapped, and there was no place that could be responsible for unifying perceptions. However, this isn't to say simply that they haven't found it yet, but at least that there is an explanation for these correlations. Jerome Feldman from the University of California, Berkeley concluded, there is now overwhelming biological and behavior evidence that the brain contains no stable